Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. When breeding boas or any other animals, unfortunately sometimes we end up with offspring that are not 100% perfect. Today I'm going to discuss the causes of some of these imperfections, the types of imperfections, what you can do to hopefully avoid the imperfections, and then what should be done with animals that are less than perfect. And so this guy is an example of an animal with imperfections. I call this guy One-Eyed Willie. He's a beautiful jungle, albino, and hypo, and he only has one eye. Otherwise, he's perfectly beautiful, perfectly perfect. Some would say he's perfect as he is, and he's actually already found his new home. So he'll be going to his new home in about a month or so, but he's doing great. I don't know if you can see, but he's missing his right eye. There's just kind of a scab there where his eye is no longer. His left eye is perfect. And so the eye issues are common in certain types of boas, especially certain types of albino boas, like the call albinos. And there's actually a couple different ways that the eye issues can happen in boas. Sometimes you'll have a litter of boas and one or more of the offspring is just missing an eye, or even two eyes. Basically, there are just scales covering where the eye was, and the animal just has no eyes, or one eye. With the call albinos, and what happened with this guy, is often they're born, or not really often, but sometimes they're born with these swollen, infected eyes, and the eyes are swollen and they have fluid in them. And unfortunately what happens, the boas go on to shed, and typically they just shed out the eye, which is what happened with this guy. And he lost his eye, he just has the scab now. And over time the scab will go away and the appearance will be more like the smooth appearance of an animal that just never had an eye. But that's what's going to happen with this guy. And some people have said that if you treat them aggressively with certain types of ocular antibiotics, that sometimes you can treat this and the animals will shed and the eye will go back to normal. But sometimes they just shed it out. And that's what happened with Willie here. But other than that, he's perfect. It doesn't seem to have any impact on his ability to function. He eats fine, he moves around fine. He's a beautiful looking jungle boa. In addition to lack of eyes, there's other problems that can happen, or defects that can happen in baby boas. And before talking about some of them, I just want to say that it's somewhat controversial what to do with animals that have these types of defects. So if you go back about 20 years, the consensus among a lot of breeders was that these animals should all be euthanized. They should be removed from the captive gene pool. That it's going to weaken the gene pool if these animals are allowed to survive and go on, and even as pets, because you can't 100% guarantee that no one is going to breed them. So there are some breeders who has advocated for basically euthanizing anything that's not 100% perfect. There are other breeders, and this is kind of where I stand. If an animal has a minor imperfection that isn't going to impact its abilities to survive as a pet, I think it's fine to rehome it, give or sell it to somebody who understands it's a less than perfect animal, but they're going to give it a good home and it's going to be a pet. And so basically that's what I do. And fortunately, almost all of the imperfections that I see in my animals are relatively minor, and the animal is able to survive and be a really good pet. And I'll show you, I got another example of this type of a type of minor imperfection that I see pretty commonly that I'll show you in a minute. But you might be thinking, so what exactly causes these types of minor imperfections or more serious imperfections, and what can we do to prevent them? There's actually a lot of things that can cause these types of minor deformities. And probably the most common by far is just random chance. So even if you do everything right and the incubation is perfect and everything is as it should be, there's always going to be some percentage of animals that have, an imperfection. And fortunately, it's relatively small. But when you think about development of vertebrate animals. These are extremely complicated animals, organisms that have, billions and billions of cells within each animal. And so in order for it to develop, it has to follow a program of instructions that has to go pretty much perfectly. And so if any step along the way, if there's something that goes wrong, it's going to have an outcome on the result. So even if everything is perfect, mistakes just happen by chance. But in addition to this, there are a lot of factors that can cause deformities in the offspring. Probably the most common is if you incubate your eggs, or the female, if it's a boa, with babies inside of it, if the incubation temperatures are either too hot or too cold. And so that's one of the most common causes of deformities. Also, exposure to different types of chemicals, different types of radiation, different handling. If the animal is handled too roughly, for example, when it's gravid, it can lead to these types of issues. So there are a number of things that can cause these deformities, but most commonly it's just random chance, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. So if you have a litter of animals and one or two of them has a minor deformity like this, don't beat yourself up, because it just happens. One of the most common questions I get about these types of deformities is, are they genetic? And so the simple answer to that is no, they're not genetic. So it's not genetic like a gene like the Call albino gene, or the aneurystic gene. It's not just simply that the animal has a gene that causes it to have missing one eye or have no eyes. However, it is possible there could be a genetic predisposition to certain types of deformities. And one obvious example right here, the Call albino and some of the other albinos, the Sharp, the VPI, etc., they are predisposed to having these eye issues. And supposedly it's especially bad if you breed two visuals together. And this animal was the result of a cross of two visual Calls. The mother was a junglo Call albino, hypo and jungle, whereas the father was a sunglow, which of course is the Call albino and the hypo. So I bred together two visuals. I had a small litter of just 3 babies. The other 2 animals did not have these eye issues, and this guy just had the one infected eye, which he later went on to lose. And so you could say, well, you shouldn't breed together two albinos, and a lot of people would recommend that you don't breed 2 visuals together. However, in the sense that it is genetic, the only way you could avoid this entirely is just not to breed albino boas. And when we breed morphs fundamentally are genetic mistakes. They're mutations that don't exist in nature for a number of reasons. So when we artificially select for animals that have these cool colorations, we sometimes get other things that go along with them. And so in that sense, there is a genetic component to the eye issues, although it's not strictly genetic in the sense of something like an albino gene or jungle gene or any of the morph genes. And the eye issues are also more likely due to the inbreeding that went into production of albinos rather than the albino gene itself. So as you probably know, when albinos first became available, people were trying to get as many of them as quickly as possible. So they frequently would just breed full siblings together, and they wouldn't backcross to unrelated offspring because that would take longer to get the desired albino results in the offspring. And so a lot of the original stock was highly inbred. So that's one of the more likely reasons why the albinos have these eye issues, in addition to them being albino itself. As you know, albinos lack dark pigment, so they're more prone to skin and eye issues. Obviously, you wouldn't want to take an albino boa and put it out in direct sunlight. It probably wouldn't last very long. And it's also likely that the animals which have been backcrossed and have more genetic diversity are much less likely to have the eye issues with any type of albino. And as I mentioned, it's really not strictly genetic. So there's an example of somebody who actually bred together 2 visual Call albinos that were missing a total of 3 eyes between them. So one of the parents was missing 2 eyes, the other parent was missing 1 eye, and they went against most breeders' advice and decided to breed not just visual albinos, but animals missing eyes and having obvious deformities. And in the litter of about 20 offspring, the total number of eyes that were missing was just 1. So only 1 animal was missing 1 eye. The others had perfect eyes. So again, it's not always genetic, and a lot of it might be due to the genetic background, the inbreeding that's occurred, rather than the albino gene in itself. However, in general, it's really not a good idea to breed animals with these types of deformities, and I would recommend that if you're considering one, that really you should just be keeping it as a pet rather than a breeder. In addition to the eye issues, there's several other types of malformations that boa breeders will run into relatively commonly. Often the malformations affect the head of the boa. Often you'll see things like cleft lips, cleft palates in boas, or lips and mouths which aren't completely developed. This female is a little cranky. She's going into shed. And sometimes I have a premonition. I can just tell when they're going to strike out like that. So I'll just hold her kind of away from my face. Thought I'd grab this other one. This guy's from the same litter, so he'll illustrate the same concept. And so the deformities will often affect the head or face of the boa. And in general, when you have these more severe deformities, the animals typically end up not living for very long. Typically, they end up dying within the first few days of being born. But if you have an animal that has a much less intense or severe type of malformation, typically it won't end up dying, and often it can go on and make a perfectly okay pet. Another type of malformation that I've never seen, but it certainly receives a lot of publicity when it occurs, are the conjoined boas, the Siamese twin boas. And in some cases you have boas where you have 2 of them joined together. In some cases it's basically a boa with 2 heads, or it's got one body with 2 necks and 2 heads. And some of these 2-headed boas have been produced, and they have been kept alive, and people have tried to keep them as pets, although it can be kind of tricky because the boa only has 1 body, but it's got 2 separately functioning brains, which makes it somewhat difficult to feed and take care of. And you have to really be careful when you're feeding them, because both of the heads can attack the same rodent and they can try to swallow each other. So you have to very carefully feed each head at the same time. It seems like quite a bit of work. But I've never seen a conjoined boa like that. But the most common type of deformity or malformation that I see are kinked spines. And I got this guy and his sister out because these are longicata from my Russo bloodline, and these animals are 2 years old. These animals are 2022 offspring, holdbacks from that litter. And I just produced another litter from the same parents that were born a few months ago, or about a month ago really, and they'll be ready to go to new homes in the next month or so. And so what I've found is that these animals in these litter will often have these spinal malformations, and they have these very minor kinks in their spine, most often towards the tail. And the first litter that this guy was from, I had about 4 or 5 of them that had these minor malformations. And luckily I was able to rehome them all as pets. The malformations were such that they were just these slightly kinked tails or slightly kinked spines, and it didn't affect the animal's ability to move around and digest food and eliminate waste, things like that. So they were perfectly okay to be rehomed as pets. And when I had the litter born about a month ago from the same parentage, what I found is that there were about the same number, about 4 or 5 animals that had these minor spinal and tail kinks. And so it seems like this particular pairing is somewhat susceptible to the kinking, whereas my other bloodline of boas, from the longicata boas, the Basset bloodline, I don't see any kinking. And so What could be causing this? Well, I think the part of the reason why animals get kinking is if they're in a very cramped position when they're developing in the uterus of the mother, and if there's not much space and they're kind of pushed up against the side, they might get wrapped around something, and their tail or their spine might be in a kind of a weird position, and they might kind of get stuck that way. And you have these animals born with kinking. And what I've seen is that the animals that have come from the litter with the kinking, typically there'll be slugs in the litter, often, half a dozen or so of these unfertilized ova. And the slugs can be kind of hard and rigid. So what I think might be happening is the animals are kind of wrapped around the slug. Maybe the tail is kind of stuck between two slugs or something like that. And it's kind of in this position where it kind of gets into a kink that develops in the spine because of it. And so it's possible that if the animal didn't have quite so many babies developing in there, or it didn't have the slugs, that there might be less kinking or no kinking. On the other hand, as I mentioned, some of these malformations are just not really possible to prevent 100%. And so I'll have a few animals available in about a month from my Russo bloodline longicauda litter that have these minor tail and or spinal kinks. And they'll make a perfectly good pet if you're looking for an animal that isn't 100% perfect and you're okay with that, and you're not planning on breeding it, but you're just looking for something to keep as a pet. So the reason why I grabbed this 2-year-old animal rather than one of the offspring with the kink tails is that they're still really small, and so it'd be really difficult for you to see the tail kink. And they're actually upstairs right now, so this guy was conveniently located right next to where I'm filming. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and this look at slightly imperfect boas. I hope you'll consider a slightly imperfect boa as a pet if you're looking for a pet. As always, shoot me any questions or comments you may have. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.